Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Payday the Heist for PC and PlayStation 3. This review is coming to you courtesy of Fusion Bunny. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is a cooperative first-person shooter by Overkill Software that was published by Sony Online Entertainment and released first for PS3 in October of 2011, followed by the PC release a couple of days later. And it is a download-only title, and the interesting thing about it is that you don't play as the good guys in this game. You play as a bunch of robbers, basically. So you're completing a bunch of heists throughout the game for not just money, but other things as well. And that's pretty interesting. You don't normally see that kind of thing in an FPS, even today. And so the question becomes, how did they pull that off? Did it work really well, or what? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is built on the Diesel engine. You may know that for powering games such as Flatout and the two Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter games that were on PC. But the end result here is something that looks pretty good in a lot of spots and then not so great in others. The animations in particular seem a bit amateurish. But that said, the modeling is pretty good. The texture work is alright for what it is. I mean, you had to keep in mind this was released as a budget-priced downloadable game. It wasn't exactly something that they threw at $60 price point into the main scene. So, for what it is, it actually looks pretty decent, and for the most part it runs fairly well, at least on my system right now. I do remember when I first played this thing on my older graphics card, it didn't run quite as well, particularly when there's a lot of heavy action going on, but on a more modern system it runs perfectly fine. And that may just be as well because they've patched it since then, so who knows. At any rate, the game itself looks alright. There is a problem with some of the characters being slightly undetailed, and like I said, the animations are a bit iffy sometimes. But by and large, it looks pretty solid. The sound design is decent. You have some fairly solid voice acting for the most part. Some of it's kind of cheesy, but most of it's pretty solid. You've got some very catchy music that actually works really, really well for this game, and that's one of the best parts of the game itself, is the actual soundtrack. And this actually does extend to its sequel as well. And then there's the sound effects, which are the really iffy part of the game, at least as far as its sound design goes. They're not particularly great. They're alright, they do their job, but they aren't particularly satisfying with regards to the weapons fire and things like that. And so these sound effects are really the only thing that are going to let you down on the sound design, with the rest of it being pretty solid overall, especially for a downloadable title like this. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is practically non-existent because it's a cooperative multiplayer FPS. It's just not going to have it. The basic idea is that you play as one of the 4 members of a gang of robbers, and you're going to just complete a bunch of heists throughout the game. These heists do have a variety of objectives, from just straight up taking money to taking things that will eventually become money for you anyway, and so on and so forth. But it ultimately turns into pretty much the same thing over and over and over again when it comes to the actual gameplay. And this becomes a problem, particularly when you're playing the single player. You see, the AI in this game across the board is downright terrible. But it's especially bad with your teammate AI. You see, the enemy AI doesn't really need to be much smarter than, oh, me see player, me must shoot at him. Whereas with the teammate AI, they not only have to shoot at the opposing force, but they also need to revive you, which they do. And what they should do as well is restart things when they seize up, like the saw, for example. Whenever you're trying to saw through a door, for example, you have to occasionally restart the saw. And guess what? Your teammates don't do that. Instead, they just continue to shoot at the opposing force. And so, you're stuck doing everything for them. Which is why the single player ends up being atrocious. So you relegate everything to online, which is also a problem because right now, there's basically nobody playing this game. And it's for good reason. You see, Payday the Heist has a very limited amount of content in it. There's only a few heists, even when you have DLC. And so, what you find is that the actual gameplay is very, very limited. It basically devolves into Left 4 Dead Heist Edition. There are some differences, of course, between this and Left 4 Dead, but the gameplay itself usually just ends up being, oh look, we have this thing we need to wait on because it's going to take a good 3 minutes to finish going through a door, and oh look, there's huge hordes of enemies coming toward us. I guess we need to hold the hordes off. Whoa. Now, a big difference between this and Left 4 Dead is that there are upgradable traits that you upgrade just by playing through the game and unlocking them. And there's different equipment that you can unlock and give yourself when you start up a new mission. There is one big problem with this. The unlock system is incredibly slow. It takes absolutely forever to actually unlock anything in this game. And so what you find is that, oh, well, there's this ability that's much later on in the game that I want to have because it sounds like it'd be really handy. Oh, well, I can't have that. Gee, thanks. And especially when there's so few people playing this thing online, it becomes an especially big problem because you just can't unlock anything. You can't complete heists when you're playing the single player because the friendly AI is too stupid to actually complete the objectives with you. And sometimes you actually really do need to have a full complement of players. You need to have the full 4 players. And you can't do that anymore, not unless you completely organize something with your friends. And even then, when you organize your friends to play this thing, it's really not that fun. The FPS mechanics are fairly simplistic, so there's not a huge amount of recoil with the weapons. You don't really feel like they have a lot of oomph to them or anything like that. The enemies can be kind of bullet spongy. The gameplay just becomes very, very tedious when you're just sitting there waiting on, say, a saw for a good 3 minutes plus, and then you're just going to have to stick it on another door later on that takes even longer to saw through, and so on and so forth. And so what ends up happening is that Payday the Heist becomes a cool idea with some fairly cool mechanics, like the way you don't really die in this game. You just get imprisoned, and then they can actually trade civilians for you, which is kind of hilarious, actually. But things like that make the game a bit more interesting. And there is some randomization with regards to the level design. You won't necessarily have the, for example, camera locations in the same locations all the time. You won't necessarily have NPCs in the same locations all the time. They'll spawn in different locations throughout the level. And that makes things more interesting. But the actual gameplay is so limited, and it feels so much like Left 4 Dead, that I just sit there and wonder why you wouldn't play Left 4 Dead. I mean, I guess it's because the enemies in Payday are a bit harder than the enemies in Left 4 Dead, because they actually shoot at you. But other than that, there's not really all that much to this game that makes it worth playing. It ends up being a cool concept that was just executed pretty poorly. And as a result, I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.